we have a topic from chat, which we'll use to conclude today's show. Whitney says, unrelated to the topic at hand, but it's been making me think about when 14 does eventually sunset. What are you looking for if there is a new Final Fantasy MMO out there in terms of its combat systems? I'm going to let Chris handle the first take on this one.
I think Final Fantasy XIV has done a really great job with a couple of things. First of all, they've allowed us to run content that is, at this point, like a decade old. And so whatever system you pick, it needs to be flexible enough that you can continue to manipulate it without undoing old work. So right from the get-go, like a base system like that requires a fair bit of planning to make sure, like, what if we ever want to add abilities? What happens if we remove abilities? There were a lot of design decisions that were made back in the 2012, 2013 era that still limit what they can do today because they don't want to break things. So right from the get-go, like, future-proofing a system is something that, like, how do you add classes? Whatever the rules are, they need to be broad enough but consistent enough that ideally those can stay in play. Because when you make these big movements, like the tank stance change, those actually feel really odd. And there are moments that feel really odd within Final Fantasy XIV's combat history. And they were just a natural progression of, like, we just don't want to be bound by decisions of 10 years ago. And I get that, but it just, like, they don't feel good at the time. I still don't think they feel good, like, compared to where it was. It lost something. So I don't really worry about it that much. I personally think the combat system they have is a fairly decent baseline. Obviously, you just put in new classes, new abilities as it sits. I would want more of the focus to be on what can they do to add more variety within gearing. I think gearing is very, very, very flat in 14. And so without overdoing it, I think there's a fair bit of, like, on the spectrum of gearing simplicity, Final Fantasy XIV is all the way on the simple end. So, like, just something that adds a little bit of variety to the way gearing works. By the time you factor for weekly lockouts and stuff like that, I think gearing is a fairly large friction point that we just kind of live with at this point.
Yeah, I talked about, actually, I decided to make a video because I was talking with, like, Zane Leinhardt on Twitter about it, because you even confirmed, like, they've added in perks as a part of the crafting, system, which is exciting. And then imagine if they can extrapolate that to where you could end up having all these different, pathways to gear and options to the player, because you could still keep BIS locked behind the hardest content, but then you could actually even out the power scale, because then perks could kind of make up the difference. So that video probably is going to roll out tomorrow, just generally speaking, because I agree with you on that. I do think, though, from the kind of the hit this in terms of its combat system, I think gearing is an absolute must. They need to really kind of think about that as, the long term. The reason why it's simplified, it has two values: to get new players in and to have players return, so that curve isn't as difficult. But there's other ways they could go about addressing that. I think, honestly, if they're going to make another, MMORPG, you don't want it to feel like 11. You don't want it to feel like 14. You want to have a whole nother offering. So a player who's playing 14 isn't like, I'm just doing the same thing over here. Like, why am I doing that now? I think you would go action combat, action MMO is where they would go with it if they were going to release another one. And I still think that that's actually, development wise, if they haven't started, they're probably going to wait to start that, so that from all the technology that is being implemented, they can take the best in the premiere. They can let a lot of people kind of roll out with Unreal Engine 5 and work out any problems within the development cycle, and then be able to adopt a lot of that and bring that to market. Same thing with AI technology, same thing with, cloud technology. We've seen Square Enix at its current pace struggle with servers. And so I think that there is actually so many things going on behind the scenes that it would give us all headaches if we were involved in all these conversations. But with a potential Sony acquisition, with a potential, like, what would be the network architecture behind the scenes to be able to offer, and with competition being able to step into it, that Blue Protocol is doing these things, that this game's doing these things, etc., they can kind of, ideally take an approach to say, yeah, 14's our main thing, and then over the course of this next 10-year plan, working and planning out and deciding what to do, so that like at some point, like maybe 5 years into it, they can sit here and say, hey, here's our new action, MMORPG. And I think that it would have to be different enough so that it doesn't necessarily step on its toes. So for players who really like the tab targeting, etc., they say, we have that product for you. It's called Final Fantasy 14. For players who wanted something like an action MMO, which is where the MMOs are going right now, at least there's more and more of those. New World, Blue Protocol, two highlights. Destiny, in a way, like even though it is peer-to-peer, we'll see what they decide to do in the long run. It's going to be something where I think that would give I think it has to be different enough. Otherwise, you end up just running the risk of saying, like, you gave me a new game, but it feels a lot like what you already have and what I already invested my time into. What do you think?
I mean, I think there's ways besides just the combat system to make it feel distinctly different. If you change the storytelling method, this would feel like a drastically different game. If you change the way the classes interact, if you have the ability to move to like a subclass system, that's something that just breaks Final Fantasy 14. You can't just suddenly introduce that. It would break all the old ultimates. It would just destroy things. But if you design a game with that on the front end, you change the gearing system. Like Final Fantasy 14 works very well for its community because it's a very easy game to take breaks from. It's very easy to get into. And so like it's, there's a lot about its gearing system that acts as a strength, even though those of us who've been around a long time can see that those strengths come at a cost. All strengths do. So like I think there's plenty even within a tab target basis that could make it feel distinctly different enough. If it was more open world based, Final Fantasy 14, if you're not hunting or gathering, the open world is very limited in what it offers you. You could move to being a much more open world based game that would change it. Final Fantasy 14 Crystalline Conflict has shown that this player base can tolerate and even enjoy PvP, but
and then how those jobs
if
feel
the world
way
is grittier as a whole,
right? And how those jobs though also feel way more like it feels like they have way more identity in that restrictive set than opposed to having like all these different things where they're all like, it's like, but that also means the combat in and of itself has changed too. So you're right. Like you could imagine them taking the Crystalline Conflict battle system and that's, hey, here's our new MMO, right? Like the jobs are going to feel really cool. And then you modify them with perks and gear and things like that so that it gives you all these different avenues and build variety. I think that could be something very exciting. I'd be all about that. But here's the theory I'd like to throw. This total conspiracy theory, internet. Final Fantasy 16 battle system, absolutely well received. What if they decided to say 16 is going to lead in from a narrative perspective and set up a world that now is an MMO?
I mean, I think it's a conspiracy for a while because even if it was true, you're talking about a 2030 game. You're talking about a 2032 game. Like you're like,
I'm thinking that.
So, by that time you come back and clip this and it's like, that's so weird. What's wrong with your filter that you both have colored hair? Like this is going to be so far down the line.
Back in my day
that, it just, we'd be turning the channel over to your kids. Like it would just be so far in the future. So yeah, I mean, it's a valid enough theory if it's well received, but I think we would see a lot of iterations along the way before we got to that. I think we would see a lot of steps along the way that made that feel like a logical conclusion. I don't think it would be Final Fantasy 16 releases and then they start on an MMO and then they release the MMO. I think there's other things in between there that act as good milestones to say, hey, is this really the path we want to go? Because it's an expensive and long road to go down. And I think we'd want to check in a couple of times before we've committed to something that big.
Oh yeah. I'm not saying that it would be small because even chat's saying like, it's built off of the developer that Yoshi P recruited. I'm going to butcher the name, Ratoya. So it's like being able to bring him in and have him with the 16. However, that works there, like he's been there. He wasn't there for a day to do this, like he's a part of the team in and of itself. Also, what's interesting, and the only reason why I think it would be kind of wild to see if that ended up happening is they were making a Final Fantasy 15 MMO, apparently for mobile, and they announced that. And who knows? We just started seeing information about Symbiogenesis. So the NFT, Square Enix anger frustration train is gearing up, baby. So if people were frustrated at 14 right now, just know you're going to see some people making some interesting connections and whatnot. So just if you guys are frustrated with negative content on the internet, just as a warning, note that that's probably going to be something you're going to see in your feed here in the near future. So just train your brain for it, so then you know what terms to avoid and watch out for.
I think that is the other thing to hit on, is if we get another MMO, even if it was an identical combat system, it would feel inherently differently if it was built on a free-to-play model.
Yeah.
It would feel inherently different if it was built around, less of a MSQ type storytelling method. If it was smaller stories told in chapters, it could still be narrative based, but was not so focused on a single main story with really little to no player agency. We're all on kind of the same rails, finishing. All of us are watching a television show play out, and the television show ends the same no matter what your actions are. Yeah. So there's different directions they could take even without focusing on combat system. So if the combat system ended up being a literal copy paste from Final Fantasy XIV, there's still a lot of rooms to justify why it would be a different game and not just a new expansion for this one.
Yeah. And chat's asking why 15 MMO. I mean, honestly, it's up to them. I think the world that they set up, one of the things I enjoyed actually about Comrades is I wish it was like, I really enjoy playing in this world from a multiplayer perspective. So maybe that's essentially kind of what they're thinking. But we saw Wargiver talk about, do you think they would actually just do the next MMO as a continuation with a big skip like 14.2 for example?
A lot of that comes down to marketing and SEO and a bunch of market research. I wish they'd gone with the name Final Fantasy Online, and we just kind of in hindsight, because he is right. Like when we start talking about like Final Fantasy 23 is coming out, it's going to be weird that if there are still people playing Final Fantasy 14, because from a new player standpoint, you're playing Final Fantasy 23. You're like, I wish I had like more of an ongoing universe. And like, well, if you try playing 14, that sounds so old. Yeah. And so the number is going to age it. I'm not saying you have to go like totally nuts with the numbers in general and just toss them. There's something nice about the core ones being numbered. And so if something can be numbered, I think that's really nice. It was weird that Xbox went to 360 and then to 1 and then to 1S and then 1X and then series. And then it's like, I don't know what they're doing. So it's nice for it to have a numbering system when it makes sense. I think PlayStation does a good job with that. But Final Fantasy Online is a drastically different experience than the numbered one. So just like Tactics, I think it would have been better if this was not core numbered. But that decision's already made. So how do you give up the SEO rank? How do you give up?
Oh yeah, you don't want to give that up.
Recognition.
You don't want to give it up. Final Fantasy 14 New Genesis, please no. All right, guys, that's our show today. Thank you for everybody who joined in. Thanks also that we were able to get the chat linked up between Twitch and YouTube, so makes it easier for me as I'm managing the show to highlight y'all's comments. So thank you so much for being a part of this experiment that we call Work to Game. We're going to return you guys to your normal programming over on Twitch, where Chris is continuing his Deep Dungeon runs. As a note, Chris, the one thing that did change as a part of this is the title and the category. So when you take back over, just update your title and your category and you'll be ready to rock and roll.
Weird.
What? What? All right, guys, I'm gonna hit end broadcast, and I should then just be over on the Twitch side for just a minute. And thanks everybody on the YouTube side for the likes and for the comments, and we will see you in the next live show.